No, it's not just whether it's part of China or not part of China. That's not the question. It's to do with fundamental freedom. Freedom of It's not just freedom of expression or freedom to vote. It's freedom to think and freedom from fear. It is a work in progress. We are experiencing, like, basically we are making history day by day. And as long as CCP exists, we cannot have real freedom and democracy.
Okay, now welcome to. Hey, sorry, I got the wrong button. So, welcome, and it's my pleasure to have Trevor with us today. Trevor is the producer of The Days Before Dawn and the documentary which moves me and really makes me think I should do something to help to let more people to know about it. And so I invite Trevor to join us today. Um, okay, I know this is the question that you might have come across in the past few months like 100 times, but please bear with me for one more time. What motivates you to produce this documentary?
Yeah, I basically first got interested in Hong Kong in like 2018, because I was studying economics and I was interested in, as an example of a relatively free market compared to the rest of the world, and basically the question I had was, well, how is Hong Kong having a free economy, but more so than that, free expression, freedom of the press, and all the civil liberties that were promised. How is that going to last under China? And I just started doing some research and learning about the story simply as a student of it. And when things really heated up in 2019, I continued just to learn about it. And the question I had was, okay, this is remarkable that 2 million people are out in the streets uh, protesting for their liberties. And I was wondering, well, why are they doing this? Why do they really care about this? And that's the question that I asked Avery in that first clip there that you just showed. And like, why are you guys doing this? What's the point of this? Why not just become part of China? Is how I phrased the question specifically. And he responded,
Mm.
it doesn't really matter if we're part of China or not part of China. It's about these ideas. And to understand how Hong Kongers came to those ideas and came to valuing those things, I went back through the history of protests in Hong Kong, um, and I realized it was honestly quite an easy story to understand if it's told in a fashion that explains how Hong Kongers had no say in their future back in 1984 and the evolution of their protest, really in response to that in a way. Um, and I decided, I someone needs to tell it, and I was 18 at the time, and I had no film background before, but I was really passionate about the story, and I wanted to tell it, and I was convicted that I could, and I went to Hong Kong for a couple months, and I did.
So you were in Hong Kong during 2019. I think it
Yes.
was like in the last quarter, maybe.
Yeah, I was there in October, and then I was there again in January, and so as I
Okay.
was on the
Mm.
tail end of that, things were kinda heating up with COVID.
Uh, so there's one theme, one issues that you want to raise. I can see that is like at the very beginning, Avery's talked about it is not really about being part of China, but the freedom of which. But at the later part of the documentary, actually, you interviewed Baggio, and he talked about the localism issue. And it seems there is a change in the way Hong Kong people see that throughout, beginning from 2003 all the way till 2019. Um, and at the same time, you see that there's a huge change in the approach on how they the protesters take their action. Beginning from Benny Tai, you had a huge part on Benny Tai, and then later on the fishbowl and stuff like that. So, how do you see the change, and is there any particular incident or people, I don't know, that really changed the way you see Hong Kong? Is there any particular place, maybe in point of time, that really think, oh, that is the point of inflection?
Yeah. So for me, well, okay. So I guess I have to go back to when I was studying it, and the what really changed things for me was watching Lost in the Fumes, the documentary about Edward Long.
Hmm.
That helped me really understand the localist camp better, and that got me. Yes, that so certainly. I think the big turning point um, in the evolution of protests in Hong Kong is the rise of the localist camp, because while civil disobedience is a super important idea, it is not as far removed from nonviolent protest as violent protest is removed from civil disobedience. Going and actually not just breaking the law, but using violence is is very radical. And the localists justified it, and they explained why in the context of Hong Kong it was justified. So I think, and they were not necessarily popular at first, but by the time you got to 2019, you had a city where that type of protest was commonplace, and the people were still behind the protest movement. You saw it with the district council elections in 2019. The people verified that they were still in support of the tactics protesters were using, even if they wouldn't go out there themselves and necessarily uh, fight like the valiants on the front line, but they supported the reasons that they were going out and doing that. So I think making that argument was the most important turning point in the evolution of thought behind the Hong Kong protests.
Hmm. Yeah, because interesting that you were in Hong Kong in October and then again in January, right before COVID. That was exactly the period where I saw the most confrontational incidences peak. And after the district council election in November, actually things quiet down. Do you see that when you visit Hong Kong the second time in January? That suddenly seems, oh, the the actions pretty much quiet down.
Yeah, I mean, I think definitely it was a lot quieter. The frontliners were. I mean, Polly changed a lot of things as far as how the first just the frontliners were able to go out and partake in more radical actions. But so certainly I did notice that October was there were more people. So okay, so here's a little. One of the protests I was at in October, there were people just like ready to go, like ready when the police were storming. They were just ready and they were ready to fight. Whereas in January, almost everyone was like, people were more just trying to get out of protest areas. They weren't
Mhm.
necessarily there saying to fight, but once the police came in with force, the majority of the crowd was just like, okay, let's get out and let's do it in an orderly fashion, not to escalate things. So yeah, I think after Poly U and that crackdown, things really changed. At least that was my conception of it.
Okay, interesting. Now, another question I have, actually, you talked about it a little in the event in the Freedom Fest. I think we first met. You were like interested about Hong Kong, and then you started this project. But back then, you had like no connection with the people or any of the people at the front line. So, how did you get started, and who did you make first contact, and how was the
Yeah.
experience?
Well, okay, so that's a great question. I landed in Hong Kong in October, and I just emailed every activist I had heard of, basically, and I got only one response, um, and it was actually Joshua Wong, and he basically said, "Oh, how are you gonna how are you gonna get this documentary out there?" And at the time, I didn't really have an answer because I was just starting, and I said, well, I'm still working on that, but this is my idea and this is what I want to do. And he didn't, I don't think he responded to that second email. So basically I got no bites on the front of just trying to hopefully network with some of the activists and have them connect me to other people. So I just started going to protests. I was in like Telegram channels, things like that, and meeting people on the ground. And while that didn't lead to any connections with some of the more high profile people I interviewed later, that led to some great connections on the ground with interviews that I'm planning on using in the feature documentary of some of the protesters. There are actually some interviews that I did use in Days Before the Dawn. The one of that localist whose face is blurred, that was at a protest.
Oh,
So I did probably a dozen interviews, or two dozen interviews with people just on the ground, and that was all. Those are the only people who were willing to talk to me. And those interviews were great because, especially in 2019, when you had a movement that was so organic and driven by ordinary people, you need to talk to the ordinary people to understand that movement. Um, then, as far as the activists, when I went back to Hong Kong in January, I had created a trailer with some of the footage from when I was there in October, and I put that on YouTube and Twitter, and I sent links to it in emails to all the same people I interviewed the first go around, and that's when Avery Ng and Baggio Lung both agreed to sit down with me for interviews, and Avery was incredibly helpful with connecting me with other people in the community. So yeah. So basically, it those two interviews were what launched the rest of them.
hmm. So now I know you have another project going on. So would you mind sharing your idea? So maybe
Yeah,
some of my my audience here, they might know something and they might be able to help.
yeah, of course. So basically, Days Before the Dawn, the documentary that we saw a clip from, is about the history of protests in Hong Kong leading up to 2019. But my initial idea was to cover the history of protests in Hong Kong from the handover all the way to the ultimate crackdown in recent days. And I didn't quite feel like I had all the content I needed, and I had the ability to go out and license some of the footage that I wanted to use to cover the 2019-20 protests.
Hmm.
So I released a short documentary covering, which is Days Before the Dawn, which is what is out now, covering the handover all the way up to 2017, ending with the imprisonment of Edward Lung and others from the Fishbowl Revolution and the disqualification of legislators in 2017. So now I want to put together a project that surveys the whole history of protests in Hong Kong and includes that 2019-20 movement. Additionally, one thing that I want to do is there's a lot of information about the specific people I interviewed. For example, Professor James Rice and Benny Tai have great stories about academic freedom, and I put out a short documentary about that on YouTube. But there's even more to that story there, and I'd love to include that in the future. And I want to tap into these stories that I was able to unlock, because these interviews with these people were usually 2 to 3 hours. So these were really long conversations, not just about events in public events, but it was also about their lives and how they got involved in the protest movement. And to look into their personal political philosophy, I think would be very interesting, and it would help people understand why people are out there protesting, or why people were out there protesting in Hong Kong. And that's the goal of the project, to help people understand what happened in Hong Kong and to keep a record of the history.
Okay. Now I do have a question, interesting question indeed, and which is also something I want to ask. Let me show it on the screen. Um, Jose asked whether you are optimistic about the future of the city, and given
Um,
all these changes that took place in the past
yeah, I mean,
18
what
months or so. Yeah.
I'm unfortunately I'm not optimistic. I think that it's the national security law is is crushing. It, it's going to be really hard for things to change in Hong Kong soon. The only place that I am optimistic is I don't think the central government is quite as stable as maybe they want to make it out to be. Well, it's not like teetering on the edge or anything. It is possible that ultimately the central government does weaken, and that would open up the door for Hong Kong, and they could maybe win back their freedom. But I don't think, under the current situation, no, I'm not hopeful about the future, unfortunately.
Hmm. So we also talked about a little about the movement, especially the movement when you were in Hong Kong. You actually witnessed the PolyU. Not witness. I don't know whether you were there, but that was about the time frame you were in Hong Kong, right?
Yes, I was there just before,
Uh,
maybe 2 weeks before. So the general strike. I don't remember the exact dates, but it was before the general strike. But that everyone was discussing that. Uh, yes.
so something like that doesn't seems to likely to happen anytime soon again anywhere in Hong Kong, I suppose. Um, how do you see the if there's any resistance that will carry on uh, from the past movement into the future? How do you think that people will continue to resist, or will they just give up and leave, or anything that they would
Well,
do,
certainly a lot of people have left, because there's certain there
like
are,
me?
yeah, yeah. There's a serious threat to people's safety. So I it totally makes sense. Um, but as far as how resistance will continue, while you're not going to see those kind of overt street protests that you saw in 2019 and a
Mm,
little bit into 2020. Um, you I think what to the most important thing, and the thing that the Chinese government does not want to happen, is they don't want people to still have the ideas, to still believe that freedom is important, to still believe that Hong Kong should be ruled by Hong Kongers. And as soon as the people lose that idea, then Hong Kong will truly be a full part of China. But until that day, there is still resistance. There is still a threat and a danger to the Communist Party. And I think it's very important for people, even though they can't discuss these types of things in the street, maybe in the privacy of their home, uh, to make sure their children know the true story of what happened, and to kind of counteract the biased education that now exists in Hong Kong, and the biased media who are just controlled by, or growing in, the party has growing control over all these things. And I think there's a movie, called, I think it's on Netflix, called 10 Years. That
yeah.
it's about kind of a dystopian look on the future of.
It's almost prophetic in a
Yes.
way that
Yeah.
it describes Hong Kong. I think it was in 2017, 16. I forgot like precisely when. And back then, people were like, "Oh, well, if that would happen, that would be really bad." Then no one expected that it would happen even sooner than 10 years. 10 years was actually a very optimistic kind of foretelling about what would happen to Hong Kong, unfortunately.
I think there's in the first one of the first kind of stories that they talk about in that movie, they they're literally talking about a national security law or the likes of it, and how that's affected the city. So yeah, I think you're totally right in calling it prophetic in a way.
Yeah. And okay, so now you're working on your new project. Probably you are not going to visit Hong Kong anytime soon.
Yeah.
And so someone here, Michael, he said, in case you need any help, you can connect with him. I think he left his the message on your uh, uh, YouTube channel. And so I think my last question being, is there anything that you think would help your project? And please do let us know and see how we can facilitate or line up people or the resources. I mean, it
Yeah.
is a
Well,
pretty open
okay. So
world now.
before, I mean, I guess one thing when you ask, why I made the film, another thing that I should add is not only did I find this story about Hong Kong interesting, but I genuinely found it inspirational. When you grow up in the U.S., you hear kind of a lot of people talking about um, values of freedom and things like that in school and in history, and but you don't really, in day to day life, no one talks about those types of things. No one really talks about a fight against tyranny, a fight for good against evil. Um, and to see Hong Kongers valiantly waging that battle against such an evil regime uh, was something that I really wanted to support. So that was the reason why I was willing to take, I guess, risks in making the film and putting some money into it when I had no idea what I was doing at first, and then I learned quickly. Um, but that's what really drove me in those early days in October when I was just learning about this whole world. But as far as supporting the future project, there right now you can support my work on Buy Me a Coffee. There's a link in my Twitter and Instagram. If you go to Buy Me a Coffee /Trevor Klein, you can find my page on there directly, where you can donate. You can also go to my Instagram or Twitter or YouTube for that matter and find links to it. On Instagram and Twitter, you can find me at Trevor M. Klein. And if you have any leads on footage or clips and stuff like that, you can also DM me on Twitter or Instagram.
Yeah, that would be a big one because now I know it's really hard to get the footage. And
Yes.
so yeah, if anyone has the access, please do get in touch privately. And so Trevor, thank you very much, and I really appreciate what you have done. And it is really important to have a record of on about what happened in the past, given it is not only the short-term memory problem, but there is a conscious effort out there trying to paint the history in another light and tell another kind of story about Hong Kong. And so we need to do our work to make sure that our future generations know what happened. And really, thank you very much for your work.
Thank you, Simon. I appreciate you having me on, and thank you for, I mean, what you've done over the years and fighting for Hong Kong.
So we'll keep in touch, and in case your project get to another stage, we have something to see and stuff like that, do let us know. And we want to be the first to know. Okay?
Great. Thank you
Okay.
so much.
You have a good one.
You too.
Okay, bye-bye.
Bye.